So today is the part of our story in the book of Esther in the book of Esther when things begin to really come together, when the pieces we've been working on and that we've been going through start to really tell the story. We've been introduced to the heroes, we've been introduced to the villain, and we have the main plot of the story so far that we've gotten to. Now, there's a couple things to remember as we come into this, and this is that when we talk about the villain of this story, and we talk about evil in general, that it is always at the center of its own story. In fact, that's one of the things that gets it into so much trouble, is that evil and that the villains are always the center of the story that they tell, which means that they are always going to overcompensate. They're always going to push things just that little bit too far because they don't know where to stop. There's nothing there to tell them when to stop. So they're always going to push it just that much farther. But the second thing for us to remember, though, is that all God needs is just a little space. In fact, that's what we begin to see happen, is that the folks who leave him even just a little bit of space, God can be at work and can do big, amazing, incredible things. And so those are the things that we're watching for and that we're going to see begin to really come together this morning. But in order to get there, I wanted to kind of go back and review some of the cast of characters of who we've got in this story so far. At first, we were introduced to King Ahasuerus, who was a big, larger-than-life, just a big, lavish, outlandish sort of guy. The bigger the spectacle, the happier he was, and that's kind of who he was. He's not a villain in this story, but he kind of acts as a foil for the villain and becomes the one that will put all of these other pieces into place, even if he doesn't really know what he's doing. The next character we have is Queen Vashti. She was the first victim of the story, and that's why I have that up there, because she was the one who we only ever meet her briefly. And if you remember, I described her as being like when you start an episode of Law and Order and NCIS or any of those police procedurals, they're the person that the crime is going to revolve around. But then she disappears from the rest of the story. And her crime was she dared to stand up for her own dignity. And apparently that's not a good thing in the eyes of the king and the king's court, because they didn't like that. And it's the king's court that they are the ones that, the advisors to the king that said, well, king, you can't have a woman standing up to you. That's just not right. I mean, other women, they may start getting ideas if you do that. So they advised him to get rid of Vashti, to depose her as queen, and then to pass a law even that says, women, you have to know that you are subjects of your husband, and you have to do everything that they say. We all know how well that actually works. And so that's who they are. And then we have Esther. Esther, who is the hero of this story, who, if you remember how she came into being in this story, that she is a cousin of Mordecai, a younger cousin. He was raising her. She is Jewish. Mordecai is Jewish. And then when the king needs to find a new queen, he holds a beauty pageant and voluntells a bunch of young women that they are to be a part of that, and she is offered up as tribute as a part of this beauty pageant, which she then wins and becomes queen, and she becomes then the main hero of our story for how we're going to get through all of this. On the other hand is her cousin Mordecai, who is not the main hero of this story, but serves a very important role. And he is the one that is there to support, encourage, and sometimes as necessary, kind of prod Esther just a little bit to go and do the things that are necessary. But then we have our villain, our evil villain, Haman. Or, if you remember last week, I compared him to Dolores Umbridge in Harry Potter, because they are, both of them share some very similar characteristics. They're not the smartest villains that are out there, but they are very good at manipulating people. Very, very, that's their big talent, is manipulating people. And so we've got, so I love this comparison of Haman to her. She's like the only villain I know of in most modern, especially young adult fiction that everyone really agrees no one likes. Just no one likes her at all. So that is, Haman is the main villain of the story, who is the one that proposes the law that is going to kill all of the Jews out of an inner office feud. Because, that's just what villains do. So our next character in this story is the people of Susa. They're the ones that are watching all of this taking place. They are gasping at the right times. They are cheering at the right times. And most of the rest of the time, they are sitting back eating popcorn, watching all the events unfold around them. Because that's what they do. Remember when we ended last week at the end of chapter 3, that they were the ones when the law starts to become public, what Haman and Ahasuerus have concocted, that they are the ones that are like, oh wow, we can't believe they're going to do this, and they're starting to be afraid of what is going on. And then you have the Jewish people. They are the ones who are seeing this law come into place and having to figure out, what do they do? Now, if you don't recognize the picture, this is from an old movie called The Three Amigos, and these are the people of Santa Poco, who, if you remember, at the end of the movie, rise up against all of the bad guys and help the heroes to defeat the bad guys. And that's going to be foretelling how the book of Esther is going to end. And so this is, so I thought, oh, these would be good folks to put in there for that. But they are the ones who are first worried about what's going to happen, but then they are now having to look at it and see, well, how are we going to overcome this challenge that is in front of us? And our last character, who is really out stuck doing the laundry because he doesn't get any mentions at all in the book of Esther, is God. He never gets mentioned in there, but we can see God at work through so many places of the story. If only for the folks that are letting him find that place. The only really and truly evil person in this story is Haman. But even if he is the only real villain of the story, it shows the impact that even one person can have on the lives of so many other people. But as we're going to see, God is still at work with those who give him the space to be at work. The book of Esther reminds us that God doesn't just act in big and flashy ways, but acts through us as people, and that because of him, we can have great impacts. Where is it that we're finding ourselves now? Last week we got the big plot point of the story that's going to set the tone for everything that's going to come after, where Haman has this plan concocted to kill all of the Jews, and he gets it past the king because he offered the king an enormous bribe that was going to be taken probably from all of the plunder of all the Jews that he was going to kill. Remember, this was going to be like almost a full year's income for the king, that this was the size of the bribe that he was giving. And all of it due to what was really an inner office feud. Like the episode of The Office is writing itself in the book of Esther here. They just escalates it beyond all recognition of anything. Because remember what happens, Haman gets a big, huge promotion. And everyone is then told, well, you have to bow to him when he walks by you. And everyone is bowing to him except for Mordecai. Mordecai's like, I'm not going to bow to this guy. Why am I going to do this? And then Haman escalates it from there. Remember, Haman is a dumb, evil villain, but he's good at manipulation. And he gets all of this by the king. And now Mordecai and Esther have to figure out, how do we get through this? How do we get this all taken care of? How do we get this so that all of our people don't die? And this is where we get the title for this series, Outsmarted, because they have to outsmart everyone else. Evil can be dumb and they can get away with it because when you don't have to worry about things like ethics and morals and the value of other people, that really leaves you the ability to do a lot of things if you don't have to worry about any of that stuff. And you don't have to be particularly bright either. You can do a whole lot of anything that you want, and that's what we see Haman doing. But for good to overcome that kind of evil, they have to be smart. Because they have to deal with all of those things. And they don't have to be just smarter than the villains. They've got to be smarter than the context they find themselves in. And you can only kind of blunder about wildly for so long before you actually have to do something intelligent. And for Esther and Mordecai, they don't even get that time. They've got to come out and their first shot at this being smarter than everyone else because they've got such a very narrow window to get through to the end of the story. Part of being smart, though, is also being humble. Recognizing the boundaries that you have, recognizing the limits of what it is that you can do. And if you can do that, then all of a sudden you find yourself leaving space for God to be at work. We pick the story up with Haman finding out what it is, or with Mordecai finding out what it is that Haman has planned. Remember, the new law has gone out to all of the capital city, and it's starting to make its way out to all of the kingdom. Mordecai finds this out, and he is afraid of this. And so he has to get in contact with Esther. Now, he can't just walk into the palace and go see Esther, because that's not how that works. So they start sending messengers back and forth, carrying letters. And Mordecai sends a message to Esther, telling her exactly what's happened. And this is all news to Esther, because being a queen and being a woman means that she has been shunted off to the side and not told anything. They're expected to be in her part of the palace and look pretty, and that's all that Ahasuerus wants. So she knows nothing of any of this that's going on until Mordecai tells her. And Mordecai in that letter tells her, you've got to do something. You're queen. Esther doesn't know what she's going to do about this. She writes back to Mordecai and she says, I can't. Like, literally, I can't do this. I can't just show up in front of the king unannounced. If I do that, and he doesn't like seeing me there, I'm dead. Like, there's a very narrow chance that he's going to say yes to that because he hasn't even called to see me in 30 days. I can't just show up there. I'm going to be taking my life into my hands. Mordecai then replies with some of with the best known passage out of the book of Esther and some of the most well-known words from the Old Testament. He tells her this, he says, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. No one else knows that Esther is Jewish. Just her and Mordecai. They're the only ones that know. Remember, back at the first part of the story, Mordecai tells her, don't tell anyone that you're Jewish. No one else knows this. So no one else knows that she would be just as affected by this law as the rest of the Jewish people. And so I can almost feel like this gut punch that comes to Esther when Mordecai tells her this. Tells her, no, you've got to do something. Because it's your family that's going to be at stake in the middle of this. And his words hit her hard. She writes back to Mordecai and she says, tell all the Jews in Susa, tell them to fast for 3 days. And then me and my attendants, we're going to do the same thing. And then she says at the end of this, I'm going to go to the king uninvited, and if I die, I die, but at least I will have tried something. So let's put all these pieces together. Esther, this is where we find out who Esther really is. Because do you feel kind of the import of what it is that she is beginning to take on? And this is where we find out that she is smart, much smarter than Haman, but that's a very low bar that he's established. But much smarter than everyone else. Quite frankly, much smarter than me, because my first reaction to doing this would be, if I've got one shot at the king, I've got to put together the world's best argument to get him to rescind this law. Then I don't know how I'm going to craft this thing, but it's going to take me all of 3 days to get all of that put together so I can go and see him. And in that one shot that I might have, because he might not let me see him, I've got to convince him to rescind this law that has been passed. It's going to cost all of these people their lives. And so, of course, the thing that Esther does is that she goes, she puts this together, and she doesn't give him that argument at all. She doesn't make that argument. She doesn't do that. They get through the 3 days of fasting. She goes up in front of the king. And the first part of this that goes her way is that the king doesn't immediately send for her to be killed. He says, all right, Like I can see Ahasuerus back there going, well, I haven't seen you in a while. Maybe I'll just, I'm interested to hear what it is you have to say. And so lets her speak. So, she breathes a big sigh of relief at that point. And she makes her request. And she says, she makes her petition. And she says, King, I'm going to throw a party. And I want you and I want Haman to come and be at this party. And it's going to be later today. That's not where I would start things. Like, that doesn't seem smart. Lives are at risk and you're going to throw a party? This is where Esther is smarter than me. Admittedly, sometimes that doesn't take a whole lot. But she is playing to the lavish lifestyle of the king. She's playing to all of his outlandish ideas, to his sense of spectacle. He is not at all what he expected to hear her say, so he's kind of interested now in what's going to happen. And then he says, well, go ahead and you've got another request, make another request. And this is then where she says, and I'm going to do the same thing again tomorrow. And I want you and I want Haman to come to my party. I'm going to throw tomorrow also. One of the smartest things that she does is that she includes Haman in all of this, because now Haman can't claim any trickery. He's going to be there for all of the things. Now, if I'm Haman at this point, those little hairs in the back of my neck had better be standing up, because I'm going to know something's up and I have no clue what's going on, because it's coming. And she is playing to the king's sense of anticipation in building it up, and he is probably eating up every bit of this. Now he's remembering why he liked Esther to begin with, because when Esther was chosen as queen, she had won over everyone through the entire process. Remember, this was a beauty pageant that took 6 months of preparation before they ever had the pageant itself. And so, she had won over everyone through all of that period, and he's remembering now why he chose her. And she's building up the scene so that later she can make the request to do something about the law to kill all of the Jews. But she couldn't start there. She was taking enormous risks in all of this. But here her preparation with fasting put her in the right place so that she could plan. And because she is not the center of her own story and she's taking this time and doing all of these things, there is space here for God to work. And that was important because, remember, Esther probably didn't know too much of who God was. They'd been living first in exile and then in the diaspora for so long that she knew that she was Jewish. She knew that that meant something, and probably knew that they had a God that was different from everyone else, but probably didn't know a whole lot more than that. It's why we don't ever see any mention of God through the entire book. But she was still leaving space for God to be at work. And that the king so readily invited her to speak shows that first moment when God is working. Because he could have gone either way. It was a very small thing to have happen, but it set the stage and let her go and do what needs to be done. And then we find that she is in the right place for such a time as this to make the petition to come up against the plot that Haman has going. Now, often we look at Mordecai, and he gets a lot of flack in this situation because folks will say, they'll look at him and say, well, they never would have been here if Mordecai just would have bowed down to Haman back at the beginning of the book, and then we never would have gotten to this place. And quite frankly, that's the dumbest and easiest way of trying to understand something that I think I've ever seen. Because we forget something sometimes about villains like this. Remember, they're the center of their own story, and they're always going to escalate, and they're always going to overcompensate. It wasn't so much that Mordecai did something wrong that caused Haman to go berserk like this. It was that Haman was looking for an excuse already. Haman was already had those ideas in his head because, remember, Haman's people and Mordecai's people, they didn't already get along. All Mordecai did, and he made a big mistake here when he did this, but it wasn't something that should cause anything like this. But Haman was looking for an excuse. All Mordecai did was give him the reason to do it. If it wouldn't have been Mordecai, it would have been someone else. Because dumb villains are predictable, if nothing else. They are predictable if nothing else. And so God had to be ready with his own people. And this is God at work. Not in big, huge, flashy ways with the great miracles and the parting of seas and all that sort of stuff that we see in other parts of the Old Testament, but through the people that have faith, or through the people who at the very least have provided the space for God to be at work. And he can use that in great ways if they just let him in to do it. And the same thing is true for us even today. I hear folks say they want the big flashy miracles. If God would just do the big flashy thing, then everyone would come and believe and things would be fine. And I know people better than that. People would just find some sort of way of rationalizing it away and justifying it and ignoring it completely because that's what people do. What works well is that God uses his people, uses us as his agents to do the things that need to be done. To be the people that he wants us to be and to leave that space for him to work, and great things can happen. So my challenge for us as we prepare to go from here today is that we be people who leave that space for God to be at work. And the more, as Donna was talking with the kids earlier, the more that we work on that, the more that we work on our faith and grow in our faith, the more space that we can leave for God to be at work. But really, God just needs that little space. We can leave God that space, so much can happen. So let us go and let us be those people that leave that space for God to be at work. And let us do that in the name of the one God sent into the world to show us that in a way that we had never seen before. Let us go and be those people in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.